Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about the environment of institutions and how institutions can affect climate change and our health with my guest, Dr. William Bronston. He is a psychiatrist and author with his most recent book, Public Hostage, Public Ransom, Ending Institutional America. He is founder of Tower of Youth, the DBA for the World Interdependence Fund. His previous positions included being ward physician at Willowbrook State School, which became Willowbrook Development Center, but is now closed and is a university. For decades, he served as medical director for the state of California's Department of Developmental Services and for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. He is also a member of Physicians for a National Health Program and for the American Public Health Association. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's really a joy and an honor. Thank you.
You have been a voice for decades for people with mental retardation, developmental disabilities, for cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, polio, sensory loss, so many people with problems that traditionally had them institutionalized, and yet you worked in institutions where you believed that there were better solutions to help solve the crisis of mental health and disabilities.
Absolutely.
You were very instrumental in the 70s in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, and you were active for many decades with other issues regarding health and mental health and physical health to the point where you're still advocating for single-payer health care.
Yes, that's right.
But yet you started your experience in an institution which was considered one of the worst in the country. Could you describe that experience? Because after I read one of the chapters about the people there, it was really disturbing how insensitive the staff were and how the people were not really getting the care necessary to solve their problems.
Well, the fundamental problem is that Title 19 of the Social Security Act established in 1965 a major financial incentive for covering medical services, but more devastatingly establishing an institutional culture in our society that funded congregate segregated facilities. Because at the time, the Congress was so impacted by the end of the Second World War and the fear of communism that they did not want to establish a policy commitment to financing families to support dependent members of the household. So they insisted on building in the requirement to fund facilities, not families, in order to care for, to service this unwanted, devalued population. And at the time, the whole medical community was absolutely aligned with urging families, if they had a kid that had a disability, to put that kid away. I mean, it was absolutely inhumane and gravely ignorant at the time. And it's taken an enormous amount of policy and political struggle in order to radically change that backward attitude of the physician community. The country was essentially financed through Medicaid with facility programs, the nursing home system. In New York, there was no community-based small programs to service people with special needs. All that the New York State monetary and governmental system was committed to was large institutions, starting at 200 beds and going up to Willowbrook, which was 6,000 beds. My work at that particular place came as a result of the fact that I was trained here in California at Children's Hospital and during my medical school time with the most significant leader in the country around developing community-based services for kids with special needs in terms of providing comprehensive support for their families, to keep the kid at home, to keep the kid in the community. So our whole effort was to deinstitutionalize California and to deflect anybody from being placed into an institution, a person with a developmental disability. And when I got to New York, apart from a couple of other jobs that I had prior with the National Nutrition Survey and whatever, I got this job at Willowbrook because I figured that I would understand and had been trained really powerfully in developmental service technology, in moving people with special needs into the center of things, in inclusion and integration into society. And when I got to Willowbrook, I was absolutely thunderstruck at the horror, at the barbarity, at the deprivation of that situation. I was a single physician that was placed in charge of 200 broken children that were in my particular building. I had never seen anything so backward, because when I came out of Children's Hospital, there were 400 to 600 top professionals, consultants, working at Children's Hospital with only 300 beds. So to be one doctor, and the charts were so empty of any kind of meaningful diagnostic or programmatic information. I was just aghast.
Your stories and the pictures in your book are, quite frankly, horrifying.
The reason I put those pictures in, Nancy, is because I wanted people to understand the violence of institutions, not the spectacle or the differentness of people that are very, very different from us because of congenital disabilities or whatever. My grouping into 4 photo chapters is a way of helping people better understand and explaining it for the couple of pages of introduction, the violence of an antisocial, anti-caring environment, an institutional environment funded by Medicaid.
While I agree that it's healthier for people to stay with families, have the families have the financial support so they don't have to go broke to be able to take care of somebody with special needs, I do believe that there are occasions where institutions can and should exist, but they need to be humane. They need to have natural environments. They need to have caring staff. They need to have the support.
My book essentially rejects that solution. I believe that there is nobody, no matter the gravity of their disability, that requires congregate, segregated care. When you take people that are very devalued and you put them together, it only compounds the stigma and the low expectations and the distortions of the way in which people are going to relate to those folks. It's not a matter of requiring that a family must take care of their different kid. It's a matter of making sure that when we service people that are very different, we do it in a very normative way. We do it in the middle of things, in the middle of society. We do it in small environments of 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 beds maximum in any kind of a living arrangement, and we try and avoid shift staff, because what you want to make sure of is that the people that are servicing and caring for people that are different identify with those people as family, not as objects, not as monetized commodities.
And you're also concerned about the older generation being in assisted living, being in nursing homes, being in long-term care.
You're talking about us, right? You're talking about when we are all aging. And as we age in our current system, we are going to be institutionalized the way in which people with developmental disabilities were institutionalized grossly back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
I personally have performed as an ethnic dancer in these facilities, and I've seen the difference between those with quality care, those where the places have nature for people to go out and sit and enjoy, and those that are not well cared for and are crammed together in rooms and don't have the natural environment. There's a gigantic difference between the quality of care.
Let me tell you that Willowbrook was one of the most bucolic, gorgeous environments. It was a 300-acre area in Staten Island with 60 two-story stone buildings in it. The problem was that the staffing was so minimal that there was never the possibility of taking anybody outside, regardless of the beauty of the environment. The institutionalization and the lack of staffing, the lack of value, the lack of looking at people that are different as human beings in our society and our culture essentially resulted in such minimal financing of the caring community in the institution that people could not go outside. I had 2 ward workers on each of my wards that had 50 people each in them. And so you cannot have a group of people be taken outside and only have 1 worker left back on the ward, if even that. The whole corruption of the situation is profound and has to be exposed.
This is why you actually were instrumental in a federal case and also getting issues like this to the Supreme Court with the Olmstead decision. Could you explain that?
Yes, certainly. I began, first of all, organizing the families over a period of the first year and a half, 2 years that I was there, in order to see that they all shared the same problems with watching their kids deteriorate in Willowbrook. I began to develop a relationship with the large progressive lawyers around the Eastern Seaboard that were filing class action lawsuits against states for human abuse and not providing individualized care for people that were different. And we put together a federal class action lawsuit for crimes against humanity, charging the governor of the state, Nelson Rockefeller, and the Department of Mental Health in the state of New York with crimes against humanity to close the institution because we knew we couldn't fix it. We couldn't make it better. The lawsuit essentially resulted in the closure of the institution by federal action, although it took over 25 years for that to happen. All 6,000 members that were in the institution, 6,000 public hostages that were in there drawing public ransom from Medicaid reimbursement to the state that was minimally converted to services and maximally essentially deflected into the pockets of the bureaucracy was ended at Willowbrook, and it was turned into a beautiful public college called the College of Staten Island.
Could you explain the Olmstead decision?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg established the foundation in law to ensure that people had the right to an individualized education and to not be included in congregate, segregated, institutionalized circumstances. It fundamentally freed the people with special needs in our society from institutional terminus. It was preceded by a number of other legal struggles that were generated by this large disability progressive movement in the United States that involved people with sensory disabilities, physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and the joining of forces between the family organizations like the Association for Retarded Citizens, United Cerebral Palsy, National Epilepsy, and the disability organizations like Disabled Veterans Organization, the polio community, and so forth. That movement, that large progressive movement, similar to the black civil rights community movement, similar to women's rights community, emerged in the sequence of modernization of American policy realities and led to major lawsuits throughout the country to close institutions to ensure individualized, planned education that would essentially be designed around the needs of the child rather than the imposition of the limitations of the school and education delivery system. That ultimately led to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which became the floor, the ground of establishing full access for people that are different in our society. And of course, the reality of the fact that there was revolutionary technology changes that were made that miniaturized and essentially established a whole new world of tools that allowed people to move around in society, to be in restaurants, to be in theaters, to be on the street, to go to market, to be out in the world, so that it's now very common for us to see a tremendous amount of accommodations in our society, changes in the width of doorways, changes in the yellow bumpy plates that are in the ground for people that are using visual canes for movement, changes in the way in which people with hearing disabilities can be accommodated in terms of services in our culture. It's only beginning. It's only just beginning, because what we're talking about is flattening the society in terms of ensuring that everybody has respect, everybody has a role to play in the culture, everybody has a major contribution to make, everybody has a sense of dignity and liberty in our culture. That's what these lawsuits have been all about, and this major movement mobilized from the entire disability community in America, similar to what's been going on with women, people of color, LGBTQ community. We're essentially democratizing and empowering the world.
Why do you believe that solving the institutional health care problem is an environmental issue?
We create financing for facilities. We could create financing for environmental development. It depends upon how law is written. And as we have been struggling since 1965 with the very harsh limitation of funding facilities instead of people that need services. We need to change that policy in order to frame in words what it is that we're looking for in order to serve people that will empower them, that will essentially nurture them, that will comfort them, that will dignify their lives in our society. It's a matter of how we frame the law, how we frame the policies. And what's been happening is that we have been essentially hammered into becoming monetized commodities as a surplus population as we become essentially removed from the workforce. That has to be ended. We have to understand the grave negative impact that that policy has and frame a way of building financing that essentially would support the kind of goals and the kind of world that you're describing in your agenda for the environmental improvement.
Regardless of the person's health, disability, age, isn't it important that we all get more connected to nature?
Absolutely. The question is, how do we build the kind of conversation in our society, in the media, that can do that? For example, when you look at television, you look at National Geographic, or you look at Our Planet, I mean, those documentaries are so inspiring. They're so absolutely rivetingly beautiful. The question is, how do we get beyond our couch and our television into the reality of those magical, inspiring realities of our world? Our world is miraculous. It's magnificent. And we live in our urban world in a very limited environment. That's a matter of the leadership, the political leadership, not establishing the kind of challenges and the kind of invitations that would alter our day-to-day lives.
You have so many incredible stories in your book, Public Hostage, Public Ransom, Ending Institutional America, about your experiences at Willowbrook, about your court cases, and people can read more about them at your website, which is very simply publichostagepublicransom.org.
Correct.
We are going to talk more about the impact of institutions on people, our health, and the environment when we return in a moment with Dr. William Bronston.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. William Bronston, who is a psychiatrist and author. You also founded recently Tower of Youth, which is the World Interdependence Fund. What do they advocate?
The Tower of Youth was a separate organization that I set up here in California because I was interested in providing high school students with support to become media communicators. We were essentially organizing 2 annual film festivals every year that hosted between 800 and 1,000 high school kids on a school day in order to show on a competitive basis their video media productions. Because at the time, the cell phone still had not been invented. The cell phone didn't come out until 2008. So we began in 1997 inviting kids to produce short movies, first of all regionally, and then North American-wide, the U.S. and Canada, I invited the best movies made by teenagers to be submitted, to be juried by 30 of their peers that sat in my home with $1,000 worth of pizza for 3 weeks, and then to host and display those magnificent movies made by teenagers completely.
Were they covering environmental topics and care for the earth?
Absolutely. Environment was one of the fundamental issues, as was the arts, as was beauty, as was short story, as was animation, and so forth. There were 9 categories.
Why do you consider dealing with the problem of institutions an environmental issue and one related to climate change?
First of all, the medical industry is one of the largest carbon footprint industries in our economy. there's a massive amount of carbon utilization in medical services. The institutional system in our country has been funded to the level, get this, Nancy, of $6 trillion of Medicaid money. It has essentially created this gigantic community of nursing homes, supported living, hospice systems that essentially are ransom-driven programs, essentially removing people from the community and putting them into congregate, segregated facilities. That is the terminus for 100% of us, short of the very richest people, that can afford an individual to provide care for a dependent member of the family as they age and essentially pass out.
You point out in your book that the current system is such that someone practically has to become poor and sell off all their savings and assets to be able to get any financial assistance.
Exactly right. You can only have $2,700 total assets if you're going to be eligible for Medicaid, and Medicaid is the only public financing system that assists in segregated institutional living, nursing home existence. And as we age, we are all going to become cognitively, physically, medically dependent and unable for our families to maintain in the normal home situation without staff. Medicaid is so evil. It essentially forces people into poverty. It soaks all of their resources regardless of how much money. The cost of out-of-home facility-based placement is absolutely outrageous, and it has to be ended. We need universal, single-payer health care.
Are you saying that the long-term care facilities, the institutions, are unecological, unsustainable, both unhealthy for individuals as well as for the environment?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's no way of replacing institutional and universal reality in our culture where we should really be dealing with people out in community, integrated, inclusive environments that essentially allow people to function in natural settings, in places where staff can provide services. It's a matter of imagination. Because of the funding system of the last 60, 70 years, we have lost our imagination as to how to take care of dependent people in our society. And we've monetized them, not we, but the system has monetized aging and dying so that there is very little that is essentially invested in empowerment, in integration, in respect and participation in society, full inclusion in society. The linkage between institutionalization and the preemption of environmental and community living is absolutely outrageous and has to be ended. We must have a paradigm shift in how we understand and generate healthcare services which are not for sale at any price in our current system. We have a current medical market system that is a wealth transfer system, and at the end of life, Medicaid forces people into poverty. That's why the disability community is so sensitive about losing their Medicaid, because if they earn too much money, if they have any kind of remunerative work that they can do, they could lose services from Social Security and Medicaid. That's why we have to end those two systems as we currently experience them.
You obviously have the experience to know how we need to change this system, because you were for decades medical director in the state of California for the Department of Developmental Services and for the California Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. What current legislation should we be aware of, and what laws do we need to further solve the problem of people's medical care and having a decent environment to live in?
There is legislation now in California, in New York, in 17 other states, and at the national level to establish universal, single-payer, comprehensive, rightful health care as a program model that would fundamentally end the current medical market system and the wealth transfer system.
In 1981, the United Nations declared the International Year of Disabled Persons.
Right.
Has the international community outside of the United States done more in terms of these issues?
A lot of this has to do with poverty and the democracy of the society. Certainly in the Scandinavian countries, in many of the European countries, in Taiwan, there is a transformation of accessibility and inclusion of people with special needs in the society. In the poor countries where you have no curb cuts, where you have a lack of resources to be able to generate quality wheelchair mobility equipment, et cetera, you have a delay, a lag in that system. But the United States comes close to being one of the worst societies in the world in relationship to meaningfully including its people that are different. And what we're talking about here is not disability, but differentness. We are 100% individually different from each other. And to look at certain kinds of differences as a devalued difference, as opposed to simply something that we have to accommodate to make sure that the playing field is level for people to be able to get around, to be able to participate in the economy, to be absorbed in the workforce, is really a surrender of imagination and a surrender of human ethical integrity.
Your focus has been with those with disabilities or with retardation, yet I'm concerned about all people who supposedly are healthy.
Exactly.
And their lack of not getting out into nature and having a natural world. And studies have shown that when people connect to plants and animals, get outside of the buildings, their homes, their offices, their schools, they are healthier.
What you're talking about is redefining health and wellness, which is absolutely urgently needed. We must end this current monetized, cruel, barbaric medical system that we have currently in place and replace it with rightful, universal health care, which would essentially alter our whole culture, alter our relationship to one another, and redefine health beyond simply ending illness, which is essentially what our current system finances. There's no question that the transformation, the paradigm shift of health care services in our culture that has to be established by law would fundamentally fulfill in profound ways the kinds of goals, objectives, and agendas that you're talking about in terms of returning people back into an open society.
As a medical doctor, you are familiar with medications and with the importance of having pills that can help people. And yet, we have also found that in America, people take sometimes too many pills. They don't focus on their health, their food, their exercise. And we also find in the food that we eat that animals are getting antibiotics that they don't need, that are creating resistance in human beings. We also know that by protecting wild plants and wild animals, we might find discoveries of chemicals that could be synthesized that could help us solve some of our major health problems. And we need to preserve those ecosystems and those animals and plants.
The question is whether the medical industrial cartels appreciate or understand what you're talking about. Because these cartels, the pharmaceutical cartel, the insurance cartel, the hospital empire cartel, essentially are privatizing healthcare delivery and essentially crippling health education in our health professional schools. What you're talking about is not taught in medical school. It's not taught in nursing school. It's not taught in dentistry. It's not taught in social services or in psychology. We have to fundamentally have a paradigm shift in our understanding of healthcare and to end this barbaric financial extraction of wealth from the general population, which is all that the private corporate community is interested in. It is not interested in health. It's not interested in nature. It's not interested in life. It's interested in profits. We have to replace people interests in our healthcare system over profits. We spend more than 2 times any other country on earth on medical services, $4.6 trillion every year in America is going into the cartels in terms of covering illness care. The consequence of that is really devastating because we're talking about every single man, woman, and child essentially having to pay somewhere around $14,000 to $15,000 a year for coverage. And yet 1/3 of the American population either has no insurance and coverage or can't afford to use the coverage coverage they have because they can't afford the deductibles and the copays that go along with the premiums. We have to end that in order to relook at the larger, more profound goals that you're talking about dealing with our environment, about dealing with the life forms in our environment, and about returning people back to a healthy way of living. The next step is to look at my website, which is called ourhealth.pub.
I want to thank you so very much for caring about people and the environment and making these important connections, and for all your good work. Thank you very much for being my guest.
It's my honor, dear. Thank you so much yourself. I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to at least address these fundamental issues about life, well-being, environment, health, poverty, climate. All of those are deeply connected. We're in a dangerous place right now. We have to look at how to end war, how to reverse poverty, how to essentially deal with climate crisis through renewable energy sources, and to get our asses out into the community where we can enjoy the beauty of our world around us.
I have been speaking to Dr. William Bronston, who is a psychiatrist and author. Public Hostage, Public Ransom, Ending Institutional America. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.